It started with a sound like gunfire, rivets popping in sequence, steel screaming. Then a roar that shook the streets of Boston's North End. On January 15, 1919, a massive storage tank ruptured and sent 2.3 million gallons of molasses surging through a residential neighborhood at 35 miles per hour. 25 feet tall, faster than anyone could run. It crushed buildings, killed 21 people, and injured 150 more. The tank had been leaking for years. Workers reported it. Residents complained. The company's response was to paint the tank brown so the leaks wouldn't show. They chose appearances over lives. Most people have never thought about molasses as a strategic commodity. It sounds like something your grandmother kept in the back of the pantry, a thick brown syrup for baking gingerbread and not much else. But in the early 20th century, molasses was liquid money, and the reason had nothing to do with cookies. Molasses is a byproduct of refining sugar cane. You crush the cane, boil the juice, extract the crystallized sugar, and what's left behind is a dark, viscous residue packed with fermentable sugars. For centuries, that residue made rum. But by the 1900s, a far more profitable use had emerged: industrial alcohol. Ethanol distilled from molasses was used in manufacturing munitions, solvents, dyes, and dozens of other industrial products. The kind of commodity most people never noticed but entire industries depended on. And when the world went to war, demand exploded. World War I changed the calculus overnight. When the United States entered the conflict in 1917, the military needed industrial alcohol in staggering quantities. Munitions factories consumed it. Chemical weapons programs required it. The production of smokeless gunpowder depended on ethanol as a key solvent. Every bullet, every shell, every bomb that rolled off an American assembly line had a connection to the sticky brown syrup being shipped north from Caribbean sugar plantations. The U.S. government was buying industrial alcohol at a pace that made distillers extraordinarily rich. And no company was better positioned to cash in than United States Industrial Alcohol. USIA was not a small operation. This was one of the largest industrial alcohol producers in the country. A corporation with distilleries, warehouses, and distribution networks stretching across the eastern seaboard. They had political connections. Deep pockets. The kind of corporate confidence that comes from knowing the government needs what you're selling. When the war contracts started flowing, USIA didn't just meet demand. They expanded aggressively. More facilities, more storage, more throughput. Every gallon of molasses they could get their hands on meant more alcohol, which meant more money. But the war wasn't the only pressure pushing USIA to move fast. There was another clock ticking, and this one was political. Prohibition was coming. The temperance movement had been building momentum for decades. By 1917, it was clear that a constitutional amendment banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol was not a matter of if, but when. The 18th Amendment was ratified in January 1919 and would take effect 1 year later. Now, technically, prohibition targeted beverage alcohol, not industrial. But the regulatory landscape was about to get complicated. New restrictions, new oversight, new limitations on who could distill what and how much. USIA's leadership understood the window was closing. They needed to distill as much molasses into alcohol as possible before the legal environment shifted beneath them. This created a very specific kind of urgency. Not the urgency of innovation or quality, the urgency of extraction. Get the molasses in. Get the alcohol out. Get the money before the rules change. Every decision USIA made in Boston during this period was filtered through that lens. Speed over safety, volume over diligence, profit over everything. And the place where all of this converged was Boston's North End. The North End in the early 1900s was one of the most densely packed neighborhoods in America. An immigrant community, overwhelmingly Italian and Irish, families crammed into tenement buildings along narrow streets. The waterfront district on Commercial Street was a jumble of residential homes, small businesses, municipal buildings, and industrial operations existing side by side in a way that would be unthinkable today. Firefighters at Engine 31 ate their meals within sight of warehouses and freight yards. Kids played between horse-drawn carts and railroad tracks. The neighborhood was alive, loud, and deeply interconnected. These were working-class families, laborers, dock workers, tradesmen, seamstresses. Yes, people who didn't have the money or the political power to push back when a corporation decided to build an industrial facility in their backyard. And that's exactly what happened. USIA's subsidiary, Purity Distilling Company, operated a distillery on Commercial Street, right in the heart of the neighborhood. Molasses came in by ship, was stored on site, and piped to the distillery for processing. The residents had no say in any of it. This was the fundamental power imbalance that would define everything that followed. On one side, a massive corporation backed by wartime government contracts and driven by the urgency of prohibition. On the other, an immigrant community with no political leverage, no legal resources, and no voice in the decisions being made about their own neighborhood. USIA didn't see the North End as a community. They saw it as a location, convenient harbor access, close to the distillery, cheap land. The people who lived there were an afterthought, at worst, invisible. The molasses kept flowing in. The alcohol kept flowing out. The money kept piling up. And in the middle of it all, the families of the North End went about their lives, completely unaware that a decision made in a corporate boardroom was about to put them directly in harm's way. The machine was already in motion. The only question was what USIA would build next, and whether anyone would bother to build it right. In 1915, USIA made the decision that would eventually kill 21 people. They were going to build a massive molasses storage tank on Commercial Street, right in the middle of Boston's North End. The location wasn't chosen for safety, it was chosen for logistics. Commercial Street sat between the harbor, where molasses arrived by tanker ship from the Caribbean, and the Purity Distilling Facility, where it would be processed into industrial alcohol. A storage tank here meant molasses could be pumped directly from the ships, held until needed, and piped straight to the distillery. Maximum efficiency, minimum distance. The fact that this put a giant industrial storage vessel directly above a residential neighborhood didn't factor into the equation, not even a little. The man USIA put in charge of the project was Arthur Gell. And this is where the story shifts from tragedy to something closer to a crime. Gell was not an engineer. He was not an architect. He was not a construction specialist of any kind. He was USIA's treasurer, a money man. His qualifications for overseeing the construction of a tank that would hold 2.3 million gallons of dense, heavy liquid amounted to exactly nothing. He couldn't read blueprints. Let that sit for a moment. The person responsible for building a pressurized vessel, 5 stories tall in a residential neighborhood, could not read the technical drawings that described how it should be built. He had no training in structural design, metallurgy, or fluid dynamics. But he was loyal to the company, and he understood one thing perfectly: keep costs down. Get it built fast. The tank itself was enormous, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter. When full, it would hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 26 million pounds. The structure was made of riveted steel plates, a standard construction method for the era, but standard methods require standard diligence, and Gell had none to offer. The steel plates he specified were too thin, not borderline, not arguably insufficient, too thin by roughly half. For a tank of this size and the hydrostatic pressure it would need to withstand, the walls should have been substantially thicker. Engineers who later examined the wreckage calculated that the steel was approximately 50% of the thickness required for safe operation. Gell either didn't know the specifications were inadequate, or didn't care. Given that he couldn't read the blueprints, the first option seems likely. But the result was the same either way. The tank was built to fail. The riveting was substandard too. Rivets held the steel plates together, and in a pressurized vessel, every single rivet is a potential point of failure. Proper riveting requires precision, inspection, and testing. The rivets on the commercial street tank received none of that. They were driven in, and that was the end of it. No quality control, no third-party inspection, no verification that the joints could handle the stress of millions of gallons pressing against them. Here's what should have happened before that tank ever held a drop of molasses. It should have been tested. The standard practice, even in 1915, was to fill a new tank with water first, a hydrostatic test. Water is cheaper than molasses, and a lot easier to clean up if something goes wrong. A test would have revealed immediately whether the structure could handle the pressure. Leaks would show at the seams. Weak points would deform or rupture under controlled conditions. Basic, common-sense protocol. USIA skipped it entirely. Never tested the tank. Not with water, not with anything. They built it and they filled it with molasses. Millions of gallons of dense, heavy, fermentable liquid poured into a structure that had never been proven to hold anything at all. The problem started immediately. From the very first filling, the tank leaked. Brown molasses seeped through the riveted seams and ran down the exterior walls. It pooled at the base. It dripped onto the ground. The leaking was visible to anyone who walked past. Workers at nearby businesses noticed. Residents in the surrounding tenements could see it from their windows. The neighborhood kids figured it out fast. They'd bring tin cans to the base of the tank and collect the leaking molasses, scooping up the free sweetener and bringing it home. Picture that. Children collecting industrial runoff from a failing structure because their families couldn't afford to waste free sugar. The workers inside Purity Distilling reported the leaks to management. This wasn't a secret. The tank was visibly, obviously failing to contain its contents. Anyone with basic engineering knowledge would have recognized the leaking as a sign of structural inadequacy. The seams were overstressed. The rivets weren't holding. The steel was flexing beyond its tolerance. Every leak was the tank screaming that something was wrong. Arthur Gell's response tells you everything about the priorities driving this operation. He painted the tank brown. Not repaired, not reinforced, not inspected by a qualified engineer, painted. If the tank was brown, the brown molasses leaking down its sides wouldn't be as visible. The stains would blend in. Problem solved. Think about that for a second. A 50-foot steel tank holding 26 million pounds of liquid was failing at its seams, and the company's response was cosmetic. They hid the evidence instead of fixing the flaw. Appearance over structural integrity. Optics over engineering. It wasn't just negligent, it was deliberate concealment. Workers continued to raise concerns. Some reported that the tank groaned and rumbled when full, the steel plates flexing under immense pressure. Others noticed the leaking worsened after each refilling, suggesting the seams were progressively weakening. Each cycle stressed the rivets. Steam fatigued the steel, widened the gaps. The structure was degrading in real time. None of it reached anyone with the authority or the will to act. USIA's corporate leadership was focused on throughput. Purity Distilling's local management answered to Gell. Gell answered to the balance sheet. There was no independent safety oversight, no government inspector checked the tank's integrity. No engineer was ever brought in. In 1915, building codes and industrial safety regulations were a patchwork of local rules with minimal enforcement. A company like USIA could build a massive pressurized vessel in a residential neighborhood and face virtually no regulatory scrutiny. Nobody was watching. Nobody was required to watch. So the tank stood on Commercial Street, leaking, groaning, slowly deteriorating, every day. Thousands of people lived and worked within its blast radius. Firefighters ate meals a stone's throw away. Children played in its shadow. Families slept in tenements, close enough to hear the steel creak on cold nights. Above them, held together by substandard rivets in too thin steel that had never once been tested, sat 2.3 million gallons of molasses, waiting. By January 1919, the tank had stood for nearly 4 years. 4 years of filling and draining, 4 years of thermal cycling, 4 years of fermentation gases building pressure, 4 years of rivets loosening, seams spreading, steel weakening, every warning sign reported, documented, and ignored. The tank was a bomb sitting in the middle of a neighborhood. Everyone who worked near it sensed it, and the man who built it couldn't read the blueprints that would have told him why. January 15th, 1919, a Wednesday. And something was off about the weather. The day before, temperatures in Boston had hovered near zero. Brutal, bone-deep cold. The kind of January that keeps people indoors and turns the waterfront into a gray, wind-blasted wasteland. But overnight, a warm front pushed through. By midday, the mercury had climbed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. For Boston in January, that's practically spring. The North End responded the way any neighborhood would. People lingered outside. Kids played in the streets instead of huddling indoors. Workers on lunch breaks sat on steps and crates, soaking up the relative mildness. Firefighters at Engine 31 were sitting down to eat. City employees at the nearby Public Works Department went about their routines. Horses pulled carts along the cobblestones. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in a working-class neighborhood. Nobody was thinking about the tank. But the tank was responding to the weather. Inside that 50-foot steel vessel, 2.3 million gallons of molasses were undergoing a physical transformation. A fresh shipment had arrived from the Caribbean just days earlier, raising the temperature of the liquid. Molasses ferments. The sugars break down and produce carbon dioxide gas. That gas has to go somewhere. In a properly designed tank with adequate venting, the pressure would have been managed safely. But this tank had no proper venting system. The gas built up. Pressing against steel walls that were already compromised by 4 years of thermal cycling, rivet fatigue, and structural degradation. Walls that had never been tested. Walls that were half as thick as they should have been. The temperature swing made everything worse. Cold molasses is thick and sluggish, pressing against the tank with relatively even, slow-building force. Warm molasses is less viscous. It flows more freely. It sloshes, and the gases trapped within it expand. The pressure inside that tank on Wednesday afternoon was higher than it had been all winter. The warm front wasn't just a break in the weather. It was the final variable in an equation 4 years in the making. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, the equation solved itself. It started with a sound. Witnesses described a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from the ground. Then a noise that dozens of survivors compared to machine gun fire. That was the rivets, hundreds of them, failing in sequence, and popping out of the steel plates like buttons ripping off a shirt under impossible strain. The sound raced around the circumference of the tank in seconds. The rivets didn't fail one at a time. They failed in cascading chains, each failure transferring stress to the next rivet, which then failed too. The structural integrity of the entire vessel unraveled in moments, and then the steel split open. The tank didn't just leak. It didn't slowly buckle or sag. It ruptured catastrophically, tearing apart along its seams as 26 million pounds of molasses blasted outward with the force of a hydraulic explosion. The steel plates themselves, some weighing several tons, were hurled like shrapnel. One massive fragment launched more than 100 feet, smashing into the support columns of the elevated railway along Commercial Street. The railway buckled, twisted, partially collapsed. Train tracks that had been 30 feet in the air bent downward like broken fingers. The molasses erupted in a wave. not a slow ooze, not a gradual spill, a wave, 25 feet high at its leading edge, moving at approximately 35 miles per hour. Picture that, a wall of liquid 2.5 stories tall, moving faster than a person can sprint. The wave had the density and mass of a freight train, but the fluid adaptability to flow around obstacles, through doorways, into basements, and over anything in its path. There was no outrunning it. There was no climbing above it. If you were in its path, it hit you. The physics defied everything people imagine when they hear the word molasses. At room temperature, molasses moves slowly. But 2.3 million gallons released all at once from a catastrophic structural failure doesn't behave like syrup dripping from a spoon. It behaves like a flash flood. The sheer volume created a pressure wave that leveled everything in its immediate radius. A hydraulic battering ram driven by gravity and the explosive release of compressed gas. Buildings didn't just get coated in sticky liquid, they were smashed. Walls caved in, foundations shifted, entire structures knocked off their bases and pushed across the ground. The wave swept a truck into Boston Harbor. A loaded freight car was shoved off its tracks. The firehouse at Engine 31 took a direct hit. The building partially collapsed, trapping firefighters under rubble and a rising tide of brown sludge. The public works building next door fared worse. City employees were crushed when the structure buckled and fell. Some died on impact. Others survived the collapse only to find themselves pinned under debris with molasses rising around them, filling every gap, sealing every pocket of air. The victims were ordinary people doing ordinary things on an ordinary afternoon. Pasquale Iantosca, 10 years old, collecting firewood near the tank when it ruptured, swept away, killed. Maria D'Estasio, a child, gathering firewood beside him, dead. Bridget Cloherty, standing on her porch when the wave hit her home. The house demolished, pulled from the wreckage lifeless. Flaminio Gallerani, a driver making deliveries, his horse and wagon swallowed by the flood. He drowned in molasses in the middle of a city street on a Wednesday afternoon. The animals suffered alongside the people. Horses trapped in the flood thrashed and screamed, legs mired in thickening syrup, unable to free themselves. Dogs swept into the current disappeared. At a nearby stable, several horses were found dead after the molasses receded, airways filled with dense brown liquid. The wave traveled outward from the tank in a roughly semicircular pattern, following the contours of streets and terrain toward the harbor. Within seconds, it had covered an area of roughly 2 blocks in every direction. Buildings in that radius were destroyed or condemned. Beyond the blast zone, the molasses kept flowing, losing height and velocity but gaining reach. It seeped into basements, flooded ground floor apartments, filled streets to a depth of 2 to 3 feet. The residue coated everything: walls, windows, doors, clothing, skin, hair. As it got into the cracks of cobblestones, it filled gaps between railroad ties. It penetrated wood grain and brick. Within the impact zone, the neighborhood looked like it had been bombed. Splintered wood and twisted steel lay scattered across streets that were now rivers of brown sludge. The elevated railway hung at sickening angles, support columns sheared by the force of the tank's disintegration. Telephone poles snapped, utility lines dangled, and everywhere, the thick, sweet, suffocating smell of molasses hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift. 21 people were dead or dying. Over 150 were injured. Some bodies wouldn't be found for days, buried under collapsed buildings and layers of hardening molasses. The neighborhood that had been alive with midday activity just minutes before was a wasteland of wreckage and screaming, and the company that built the tank, the one that painted over the leaks and ignored every warning, They were about to face a reckoning they never saw coming. The first rescuers arrived within minutes. What they found was beyond anything they'd trained for. The North End waterfront didn't look like a neighborhood anymore. It looked like a nightmare smeared in brown. A landscape of collapsed buildings, jagged steel, and a substance that fought every attempt to move through it. The streets were rivers of molasses, 2 to 3 feet deep in places, and the screaming. People trapped under wreckage, invisible beneath layers of sludge, crying out for help that couldn't reach them fast enough. Molasses in January is a special kind of hell for rescue work. When the wave first hit, the liquid was relatively warm from the Caribbean shipment and from fermentation gases. It moved fast. It hit hard. But the moment it spread across cold streets and mixed with frigid January air, it began to thicken, rapidly. What had been a fluid wave became a viscous, clinging mass. It grabbed at boots, legs, clothing, tools, and anything else it touched. Rescuers who waded in found themselves stuck. Every step required enormous effort, like walking through wet concrete that was hardening by the minute. Pulling a victim free meant fighting against suction that refused to let go. Some rescuers sank to their waists and had to be pulled out themselves before they could help anyone else. The smell was the first thing that hit you. Then it never left. Sickly sweet, dense, overpowering. It hung over the entire district like a suffocating blanket, so thick some rescuers reported it made them gag. This wasn't the pleasant sweetness of a bakery. It was cloying, oppressive, mixed with dust from collapsed buildings, the metallic tang of torn steel, and underneath it all, something worse. The smell of blood and injury that no amount of sugar could mask. That smell would linger over the North End for weeks. Residents miles away could detect it on the wind. Sailors from the USS Nantucket, a training ship docked at a nearby pier, were among the first organized responders. They heard the explosion. They heard the screams. They came running. What they encountered stopped them cold. Men who had served in the Navy, some who had seen combat, stood at the edge of the Molasses Flood and had to process a scene that didn't match any disaster they'd prepared for. But they didn't hesitate long. They waded in. They formed human chains to pull victims from the sludge. They used their bare hands because tools were useless in the sticky mass. Every rescue was a physical battle against the substance itself. For every person they pulled free, the molasses tried to pull them back. The Red Cross mobilized quickly. Aid stations went up. Volunteers converged. Boston police arrived and tried to establish order, but order was hard to maintain when the ground itself was a trap. Firefighters from across the city rushed to the North End, but their own colleagues at Engine 31 were among the victims. The firehouse had taken a direct hit. The building was partially collapsed. The men inside were buried under rubble and hardening molasses. Rescuing them meant digging through wreckage while standing in the very substance that was slowly entombing everything it touched. The difficulty of this rescue cannot be overstated. In a normal building collapse, you dig through brick and wood and pull people out. In a normal flood, the water eventually recedes or can be pumped away. This was neither. The molasses didn't recede. It sat there, thickening in the cold, bonding to every surface, sealing victims under layers of sticky brown mass that had to be scraped and pulled away handful by handful. Rescuers used saws to cut through wreckage, then had to peel molasses-coated debris away from victims whose skin and clothing were glued to the rubble. Some victims were found alive but unable to move, their bodies encased in molasses that had hardened around them like amber. Freeing them took agonizing minutes. Minutes those victims didn't always have. The work continued through the night. Lanterns and electric lights were brought in as darkness fell, casting flickering shadows across a landscape that looked increasingly surreal. The brown coating on everything reflected the light in dull, wet gleams. Workers were covered head to toe, faces streaked, hands caked, clothing so saturated that some stripped to undershirts in the cold just to maintain enough mobility to keep digging. Fresh volunteers rotated in as exhausted rescuers staggered out. Nobody went home. The neighborhood wouldn't let them. By morning, the full scope was clear. 21 dead. Some killed instantly, crushed by the wave or by steel shrapnel from the exploding tank. Others drowned, their lungs filling with molasses as they lay trapped and unable to lift their heads above the rising tide. A few survived the initial impact only to die hours later, bodies broken, airways sealed. The injured numbered over 150. Broken bones, lacerations from steel fragments, crushing injuries from collapsed structures, and a type of injury unique to this disaster, suffocation, and respiratory damage from inhaling molasses. The thick liquid had been forced into mouths, noses, and lungs. Even those pulled out alive faced secondary drowning as residual molasses blocked their breathing. Hospitals across Boston received casualties coated so thoroughly that medical staff had to clean them before they could assess injuries. The physical destruction extended well beyond the human toll. Multiple buildings completely demolished. The elevated railway so badly damaged that sections had to be torn down and rebuilt. The public works building destroyed. Houses, shops, and warehouses reduced to splintered wreckage or condemned as structurally unsound. An entire neighborhood's infrastructure shattered in under a minute. Cleanup took weeks. Workers pumped salt water from the harbor to dissolve the molasses, hosing down streets and buildings in a tedious, freezing process. Sand was spread to provide traction and absorb residue. But molasses doesn't clean up. It sticks. It seeps. It penetrates. For months, everything in the North End had a brownish tinge. Door handles were sticky. Park benches stained clothing. Telephones were so gummed up they barely worked. Residents tracked molasses onto streetcars, into shops, across the city. The harbor turned brown as dissolved runoff flowed into the channel. The community was shattered in ways that went beyond physical damage. These were tight-knit immigrant families who had built their lives around this neighborhood. They buried their dead. They tended their wounded. They surveyed homes that held everything they owned, and as the shock faded and the grief settled, a harder emotion took its place: anger. Because this wasn't a natural disaster, not an earthquake, not a hurricane, not an act of God. This was a man-made catastrophe caused by a steel tank that everyone knew was failing, built by a company that ignored every warning, cut every corner, painted over every problem. The families of the North End didn't need an engineer to tell them what happened. They'd watched that tank leak for 4 years. They'd reported it. They'd been ignored. And now their neighbors were dead, their homes destroyed, their streets coated in the sticky evidence of corporate indifference. USIA's response confirmed every suspicion. The company didn't apologize, didn't take responsibility. It didn't offer aid. Instead, almost immediately, they began constructing a defense that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with deflection. Their strategy was simple, cynical, and calculated. They blamed anarchists. They said the tank was bombed. And with that single lie, the fight for accountability began. USIA's defense strategy was breathtaking in its cynicism. Within days of the disaster, before the last bodies had even been recovered, the company began pushing a narrative designed to redirect blame. Not toward engineering, not toward the man who couldn't read blueprints, toward politics. They claimed the tank had been destroyed by a bomb, planted by anarchists. In 1919 Boston, that wasn't as absurd as it sounds today. Anarchist groups had been active across the United States for years. Bombings had occurred, real ones. radical political movements tied to immigrant communities, particularly Italian immigrants, were a source of genuine public anxiety. Just months after the molasses disaster, a wave of anarchist mail bombings would target politicians and officials across the country. The fear was real. USIA exploited it with surgical precision. The calculation was ugly but transparent. The North End was an immigrant neighborhood, Italian and Irish families, the kind of people mainstream American society in 1919 already viewed with suspicion. If USIA could frame the disaster as an act of foreign-born radicals rather than corporate negligence, they could shift blame away from themselves and onto the very community that had been victimized. It was a defense built on prejudice, attack the credibility of the victims, associate them with the anarchist threat, make the public wonder whether these immigrant families were really innocent bystanders, or whether someone in their own community had brought this on themselves. Think about that. 21 people dead, 150 injured, a neighborhood destroyed. Winnie and the company responsible was pointing the finger at the people it killed. The lawsuit that followed was massive. 119 plaintiffs, victims and families of the deceased. They filed claims against United States Industrial Alcohol in a single consolidated proceeding that would become one of the longest and most complex civil trials in Massachusetts history. On one side, a powerful corporation with deep pockets, experienced lawyers, and a defense strategy designed to muddy every drop of water. On the other, working-class immigrant families fighting for accountability against an institution with vastly more resources. David against Goliath, and Goliath had better attorneys. The court appointed a single auditor to hear the case rather than empaneling a jury. His name was Hugh W. Ogden, an Antwerp, and the choice of Ogden would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in the entire saga. Ogden was a retired military officer and an attorney. By all accounts, a man of meticulous precision and unshakable integrity. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't political. He was the kind of person who read every document, weighed every piece of testimony, and refused to be rushed or bullied. In a case that would span years, involve thousands of pages of evidence, and feature some of the most sophisticated engineering analysis ever presented in an American courtroom, Ogden was exactly the right man. The hearings began in 1920. They stretched for years. Over 900 witnesses testified. 3,000 documents entered into evidence. The volume was staggering, but strip away the complexity, and the core question was simple. And did the tank fail because of structural inadequacy and corporate negligence, or was it destroyed by a bomb? USIA threw everything at the anarchist theory. They hired experts who testified that the destruction pattern was consistent with an explosive blast. They pointed to the political climate. They argued the steel was adequate, the construction sound, and that no structural weakness could explain the sudden, catastrophic nature of the rupture. Something external caused it, they insisted. A bomb. Sabotage. A deliberate act by radical elements within the very community now suing for damages. The plaintiff's legal team countered with engineering. They brought in structural experts who examined the wreckage, analyzed the steel, and reconstructed the failure sequence piece by piece. What they found demolished USIA's defense. The steel plates were too thin. This wasn't opinion. Engineers measured the recovered fragments and compared them to minimum requirements for a tank of that size, and pressure rating. The steel Arthur Gell had specified was roughly half what was needed. The math wasn't ambiguous, not a borderline case. The tank was built with fundamentally inadequate materials. The riveting was substandard. Examination of recovered rivets and rivet holes showed failure patterns consistent with chronic stress, not sudden explosive force. The rivets had been weakening over time, stretching and loosening with each filling cycle. each temperature change, each buildup of fermentation pressure. The failure was progressive, not instantaneous. That machine gun sound witnesses described, rivets popping in cascading chains, was exactly what engineers would predict from a vessel that had been slowly losing integrity for years. No evidence of explosives was found, none. No chemical residue, no blast pattern consistent with a bomb, no detonator fragments, nothing. USIA's anarchist theory rested entirely on speculation and prejudice. Not a single piece of material evidence supported it. Under cross-examination, the company's own experts couldn't produce physical proof of any kind. And then, Arthur Gell took the stand. The full scale of USIA's negligence was laid bare. Under questioning, Gell admitted he had no engineering training, admitted he could not read blueprints, admitted no structural engineer had been consulted during design or construction, admitted the tank was never tested, not with water, not with anything, admitted he knew about the leaking, admitted his response had been to paint the tank brown. Every admission was another nail. The company had put an unqualified man in charge of a massive pressurized vessel in a residential neighborhood. That man made decisions about steel thickness and rivet specifications he was not competent to make. When problems appeared, his response was cosmetic concealment. And at no point did anyone above Gell intervene to impose proper oversight. The expert testimony painted a picture of failure that was not just foreseeable but inevitable. The tank as built could not have held indefinitely. Every filling cycle pushed it closer to rupture. The only question was when, not if. The warm weather on January 15th, the fresh shipment, the fermentation gases, these were final triggers. But the cause was a structure that should never have been built that way, overseen by a man who should never have been in charge, for a company that valued profit over the lives of people living in its shadow. The proceedings dragged on until 1925. 6 years. For the families who had lost children, parents, neighbors, 6 years of reliving the disaster in courtroom testimony. 6 years of watching USIA's lawyers try to blame their community for its own destruction. The emotional toll was crushing, but they endured. They showed up. They testified. They refused to let USIA rewrite history. Ogden reviewed everything, every witness, every document, every fragment of recovered steel. And when he delivered his findings, there was no ambiguity. USIA was responsible. The tank failed due to structural inadequacy. The company was negligent in design, construction, and maintenance. The anarchist defense was rejected entirely. No bomb, no sabotage. Just a corporation that cut corners and a community that paid in blood. The damages Ogden awarded totaled approximately $628,000. In 1925 dollars, significant. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $11 million today. USIA was ordered to compensate the families of the dead, the injured survivors, and property owners whose buildings had been destroyed. For the plaintiffs, it was vindication. 6 years of legal battle. 6 years of USIA's lawyers blaming anarchists and smearing an immigrant community, and the auditor had seen through every bit of it. Negligent, defective, preventable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. $628,000 split among 119 plaintiffs doesn't go far. Some families received a few $1,000s for the death of a loved one. Property claims were compensated at assessed values that didn't account for the full disruption to lives torn apart. The money helped. It didn't make anyone whole. You can't put a dollar figure on a 10-year-old boy swept away collecting firewood. You can't compensate a mother for burying her child with a check. Justice in the legal sense. A fraction of what was owed in the human sense. For USIA, the financial hit was manageable. This was a major corporation with operations across the country. $628,000 was painful, but not existential. They absorbed the cost, settled obligations, and moved on. No executive went to prison, no criminal charges were filed. Arthur Gell, the man who couldn't read blueprints but oversaw a project that killed 21 people, faced no personal legal consequences, never charged, never held individually accountable. The system extracted money from the corporation but left the individuals who made the choices untouched. That gap between corporate liability and personal accountability would echo through American industrial disasters for the next century. But if the financial penalties were modest, the legal precedent was anything but. The Molasses Flood trial was one of the first major cases in American history where corporate negligence was proven through detailed engineering expert testimony. Before this, holding a corporation accountable for structural failure required proving intent, showing the company deliberately set out to cause harm. That was nearly impossible. Companies hid behind claims of accident, unforeseen circumstances, acts of God. The Molasses case shattered that framework. Ogden's ruling established that a company could be held liable for failing to exercise reasonable care. You didn't need to prove they wanted people to die. You needed to prove they didn't do enough to prevent it. The bar shifted from malice to negligence. That shift opened doors for decades of future plaintiffs. The engineering testimony set a new standard, too. The detailed analysis of steel thickness, rivet specifications, stress calculations, and failure mechanics demonstrated that complex technical questions could be adjudicated through expert analysis. Engineers became essential courtroom witnesses. The technical rigor Ogden demanded became the template for how structural failures would be litigated for generations. But the most significant legacy wasn't the trial. It was what happened in the regulatory landscape afterward. Before January 15, 1919, construction of industrial storage tanks in Massachusetts operated in a regulatory vacuum. No requirement that a qualified engineer review construction plans, no mandatory testing protocol, no independent inspection process. A corporation could build whatever it wanted, wherever it wanted, with whatever materials it chose, and face no oversight until something went catastrophically wrong. Arthur Gell's incompetence wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The system allowed an unqualified person to build a dangerous structure because no regulation existed to stop him. The flood changed that. Massachusetts enacted new regulations requiring construction plans for industrial structures to be reviewed and certified by a licensed engineer. Architects and engineers had to sign off on designs, taking personal professional responsibility for structural adequacy. Building permits became contingent on demonstrated competence, not just willingness to pay a fee. The era of build first and ask questions later was over, at least on paper. At least in Massachusetts. These weren't dramatic, headline-grabbing reforms. Bureaucratic, procedural, technical, but foundational. The requirement that a qualified engineer certify a structure's design before construction is now so embedded in American building codes that nobody thinks about it. Every time you walk into a building and trust the roof won't collapse, every time you cross a bridge and assume it will hold, you benefit from a framework that traces part of its lineage to a molasses tank that exploded in Boston's North End. The reforms spread. Other states examined what happened in Boston and tightened their own oversight. The principle that industrial structures near residential areas required rigorous engineering review became standard across the country. The Molasses Flood didn't single-handedly create modern building regulation, but it was one of the critical early catalysts that pushed American governance toward an essential truth. Corporations cannot be trusted to regulate themselves when public safety is at stake. As for Purity Distilling, it effectively ceased to exist. The distillery on Commercial Street was destroyed. The tank was gone. The operation built to convert Caribbean molasses into wartime industrial alcohol had no purpose once the war ended and Prohibition reshaped the industry. USIA survived as a corporate entity, but the Boston operation was finished. The site was cleared and eventually absorbed back into the North End's urban fabric. The Prohibition took effect in January 1920, 1 year after the flood. The 18th Amendment didn't technically ban industrial alcohol, but it created a regulatory environment so restrictive that many producers scaled back or shut down. The boom that had driven USIA to build the tank, that frenzy of wartime demand and pre-prohibition urgency, evaporated overnight. The timing is brutal. USIA rushed to build the tank because they wanted to maximize production before Prohibition closed the window. That urgency led to shortcuts. Shortcuts led to negligence. Negligence led to catastrophe. And then Prohibition came anyway. The tank didn't need to exist. The disaster didn't need to happen. Every death was not just preventable, but pointless. A consequence of corporate urgency that produced nothing but destruction and grief in the end. The physical cleanup took months, but the sensory legacy lasted longer. Residents reported that on hot summer days, years after the flood, the neighborhood still smelled faintly of molasses. The substance had soaked so deeply into wharf wood, building brick, and cobblestone gaps that no amount of scrubbing removed it completely. The harbor near Commercial Street carried a brownish tint for months. Old-timers in the neighborhood claimed you could catch the scent decades later. A ghost of sweetness rising from the pavement when July sun baked the streets. Whether that's memory or chemistry, nobody knows for certain. But the smell became part of the neighborhood's identity, a sensory scar, a reminder of the day a corporation's negligence turned sugar into a weapon and drowned a community in its own backyard. Today, if you walk along Commercial Street in Boston's North End, you'll pass a small park near the intersection with Charter Street, benches, a stretch of grass, kids chasing each other on summer afternoons, dogs pulling at leashes, the harbor glittering behind it all. The neighborhood is one of Boston's most vibrant, famous for its Italian restaurants, its narrow streets, its dense and lived-in energy. Tourists come for the cannoli and the history. Most of them walk right past the spot where 21 people died. There's a plaque, small, metal, mounted near the site of the former tank. It notes the date, January 15, 1919, and provides a brief summary of what happened. If you're looking for it, you'll find it. If you're not, you'll walk right by without a glance. There's no monument, no statue, no memorial wall etched with the names of the dead. Just a small marker that most people never notice, in a neighborhood that has long since moved past the worst thing that ever happened to it. The North End's recovery was slow but real. In the decades following the flood, the neighborhood rebuilt. The Italian immigrant community that had been devastated dug in and refused to leave. New buildings replaced the ones destroyed. New families arrived. The neighborhood's identity shifted from industrial waterfront to cultural enclave. By mid-century, the North End had become the heart of Italian-American life in Boston. The restaurants, the bakeries, the social clubs, the street festivals. All of it grew from the resilience of a community that endured something terrible and chose to stay. But the flood itself faded from public memory in a way that feels almost intentional. Unlike the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, which became a permanent rallying point for labor reform and remains widely taught, the Great Molasses Flood drifted into the category of historical curiosity. A strange footnote, an odd bit of trivia that surfaces in listicles about bizarre events. People hear the phrase molasses flood and they smile. Sometimes they laugh. The absurdity of the substance overshadows the reality of the devastation, and that's a problem. Because when we reduce a disaster to its most absurd element, we lose the lesson embedded inside it. The molasses flood wasn't a freak accident caused by a funny substance. It was a preventable catastrophe caused by corporate negligence, regulatory failure, and the systematic devaluation of working-class immigrant lives. Treating it as a curiosity lets the people responsible off the hook. It transforms a story about accountability into an anecdote about weird history. And that transformation has consequences, because the patterns that killed those 21 people didn't die with them. They repeated, again and again. Every industrial disaster that followed shares DNA with the Molasses Flood. The Texas City refinery explosion, the Rana Plaza garment factory collapse, the Bhopal gas leak, Deepwater Horizon. A corporation cuts corners to save money. Workers or communities raise alarms. Management ignores the warnings. Regulators either don't exist or don't enforce the rules. And then people die. The specifics change, the substance changes, the geography changes. But the architecture of negligence remains exactly the same. A company prioritizes profit over safety. The people closest to the danger pay the price. So what do we actually learn from a wave of molasses that killed 21 people on a Wednesday afternoon in 1919? Lesson 1. Cutting corners kills. This is the simplest and the most important. Arthur Gell used steel that was too thin because it cost less. He skipped the hydrostatic test because it would have taken time and money. He consulted no engineer because that would have added expense and potentially slowed the project. Every shortcut was a calculated decision to accept risk in exchange for savings. Everyone contributed directly to 21 deaths. When corporations treat safety as an expense to minimize rather than a responsibility to honor, the result is predictable. Not every shortcut ends in catastrophe, but every catastrophe traces back to shortcuts. Lesson 2. Ignored warnings become disasters. The tank leaked from day one. Workers reported it. Residents saw it with their own eyes. The structure groaned under pressure it was never designed to handle. Every one of those was a warning. Everyone was a chance to prevent what happened. And everyone was dismissed, buried, or painted over. The people who raised alarms were right. The managers who silenced them share the blame for every death. The most dangerous response to a warning isn't disagreement, it's silence. Lesson 3. Accountability matters, but it doesn't undo damage. The trial was groundbreaking. Ogden's ruling held USIA responsible and set precedents that strengthened accountability for decades. The regulatory reforms made structures safer. These outcomes matter. They deserve recognition. But they didn't bring back Pasquale Iantosca, didn't rebuild Bridget Clockerty's home with her still in it, didn't erase 6 years of grief while USIA's lawyers blamed anarchists for the deaths of children. Accountability is essential, but it is always reactive. It arrives after the damage. The real victory is prevention, not punishment. Lesson 4. Don't let absurdity erase tragedy. This is the one that matters most for how we remember the Molasses Flood. The substance was ridiculous. There's no getting around that. Death by molasses sounds like dark comedy, not history. But 21 people are dead. 150 were injured. Children drowned in brown sludge on a Wednesday afternoon while picking up firewood. The absurdity of the medium does not diminish the gravity of the negligence. When we laugh instead of learning, we dishonor the dead. And we make it easier for the next corporation to do exactly the same thing. The story of the Great Molasses Flood is a story about what happens when profit outweighs safety, when power silences the powerless, and when systems that should protect people simply don't exist. Purity Distilling and USIA built a structure they knew was failing in a neighborhood full of people they didn't value. They ignored every warning, blamed the victims, fought accountability for 6 years. The families of the North End fought back and won, but the victory cost them more than any settlement could repay. The tank is gone. The molasses is gone. The company is gone. The neighborhood has healed. But the lessons remain. He carved not in the small plaque on Commercial Street, but in the regulatory codes and legal precedents that trace their origins to that January afternoon. Every building permit requiring an engineer's signature. Every construction plan reviewed before ground breaks. Every industrial structure tested before it's filled. All of them carry a whisper of 21 people who died, because none of those safeguards existed in 1919. The molasses flood wasn't a joke. It wasn't a curiosity. It was a warning. And the only way to honor the people it killed is to make sure we never stop listening to the warnings that come after.